It is about the time to start our event. For those who does not know me, I'm Julia Kotlarski, member of CODE, and I would like to welcome everybody to this CODE research seminar. So just as the way we handle those online events, we ask all the participants to mute your audio during the presentation and to switch off your video. But we do please ask you to type your questions in the chat function as we go along, if you can think about something specific. And once our speaker finished her presentation, then we will have a questions and answer session. So we will be able to pick up questions from chat and to answer those. So I would like to introduce our speaker, Dorit Nevo, who is Associate Professor of Information Systems at the Lally School of Management at RPI in the United States. So for Dorit it is late evening, while for us it is early afternoon. Dorit also serves as Acting Associate Dean for Academic Affairs in her university, and her research focuses on human interactions with IT for knowledge sharing, collaboration, and innovation. And Dorit has been a long-standing collaborator of mine. We have done several research projects together, and our recent paper is on crowdsourcing. So Dorit is an external member of CODE. So this is first event when Dorit will be talking about her research, and we also welcome her as external member of CODE. Dorit, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Julia. Good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, it's 6 p.m. here. And the benefit of working from home is that I have a crazy puppy who's unhappy being behind the gate now. And so hopefully she will not bark too much. I might have to jump in and let her out in the middle. So let me share my slides. Share. All right. Can you see them? And then I'll put the chat up. Okay. Oh, awesome. Thank you. Yeah. So I use WebEx, and so there's a learning experience here for me with Zoom. I'll just quickly resize so I can actually see my screen. All right. So the paper that I'm going to present today is a fun project that we did on fake news. The title is kind of long. It's Tailoring Heuristics and Timing AI Interventions for Supporting News Veracity Assessments. So it's probably not the best title in the world, but the research is a lot simpler than the title. The main author is Ben Horn. He's a PhD student in computer science at RPI, and now he's at the University of Tennessee. And then myself and Sibel Dally, she's a professor in computer science. Lydia is an assistant professor at the School of Management, and Claire is a PhD student in computer science. So it was a collaboration between School of Management and computer science at RPI. So fake news, the definition that we use in this paper is fabricated, misleading information that is intended to deceive. So people typically talk about misinformation, which is simply false or inaccurate information, and disinformation, which is false that is intended to mislead. So there's misinformation, disinformation. Our paper focuses on both. In fake news detection, the most common these days is AI tools that basically use natural language processing and text analysis to understand if an article is correct or not. So they give you a percentage of the veracity of a news article. There's a broad range of machine learning algorithm used. There's a lot of papers that have, all their high accuracy scores. One thing they all share in common is that they required ground truth assessment. So for the training model, you have to actually tell the AI, this is true, this is false. And so you would need to determine the veracity of the paper as true or fake. Sometimes it's a little more tricky because the borderline cases, sometimes it's easier. The gap that we identified that we approached in the study is that and that's really like Ben, who's the author, did his dissertation on a really fancy algorithm that is really good at detecting fake news, and was sitting in his proposal defense. And I said, well, how do you know that it works on people, right? Because coming from the business school, that would be my first question is, well, is it really useful? And so that's what brought up the study is everybody says, yes, my algorithm is the best because it has the highest accuracy score, but nobody really says my algorithm is the best because it really changes the opinion of the people who use it. And so this is what we set out to study in this project. Um, so then if we switch over from the AI to the people, then we were trying to look at basically, well, how do people process news? How do people process information? And there's a lot of theory of information processing. What we looked at here are heuristics. And heuristics are typically rules of thumbs for forming a judgment. So for example, you can have a recognition heuristic, which is, you believe something that you've seen before. Take the best heuristic, which is basically you pick some specific attributes that are most important for you and use those. Um, and so these are different heuristics, and there's a million ones. I mean, if you think about how you make decisions in your everyday life, you all use heuristics. You all use some rules of thumb to make your decision process easier. Uh, Specifically in news veracity decisions, when we looked at the literature, that we could classify it into three broad groups of heuristics. So people either believe news or, you know, uh, assess news based on the opinions of significant others. So if Julia tells me that something is good, then I'll believe it, then read the article. So we call those social heuristics, or just the content of the source. So I read it and I looked at, not necessarily elaborated and thought about the text, but I looked at the language, that it's, scientifically and correct, and the grammar, and the words used. And I looked at the source. So if it's NPR, then I would trust it. Um, and then the last one is what we call cognitive heuristics, which is basically, I will use my own knowledge and experience to believe or not believe something. So if somebody tells me something that aligns with my own beliefs or with my past experience, then I will say, okay, yeah, that sounds true. And so these are called cognitive heuristics. And those three were discussed in the literature kind of broadly, not necessarily identified very specific rules of thumbs, but say this is what people used. And so this was our starting point into our study. And so our main question was, well, can we take these heuristics, incorporate them into the AI, and then make people trust the AI more, so accept the advice of the AI? So generally, we wanted to know, first of all, do people accept the advice of the AI? And second is, can we make it better? And so in the first study, we was just more exploratory qualitative work where we says, well, what are the heuristics that people typically use when they read news, when they assess news? And then in the second study, we took those heuristics, designed them into the advice of the AI, and looked at how it affected people. Any questions so far in the background? I tend to speak really fast. My students always complain. So just tell me if I need to slow down. I probably won't, but at least I'll know that I need to slow down. Anyways, the method, I'm going to talk about the method first because it was the same, and it was a very simple study. So, we'll just get this out of the way. We collected data on Amazon Mechanical Turk. If you know what it is, it's a crowdsourcing platform that people sign up to do little jobs. They're called hits. And you can post your job there, and you say, I'll pay you $50 for, filling out the survey, and then people will do it. Can I explain something on heuristics? Calvin, let me, I have a slide about the heuristics that we found. And so that will probably make it a little more concrete than abstract. So if I'll in a couple slides, I'll get there, and then I'll elaborate, okay? So Mechanical Turk, you can set it up on how much money you want to pay, and if you want high quality workers, so there's how many jobs they did in the past, and if they got good reviews. And so that's where we posted our surveys. And our survey basically was, we gave them 10 different articles that covered everyday news topics, climate change and vaccinations. We gave them both true and false articles. And then we started this study, it was October, and then COVID hit. And so then we wanted to see if people's opinions about news changed, because nobody knew anything, right? The world was everybody were completely uncertain about everything. And so we gave them more articles on COVID. We ran the study again. So let me just show you an example. So here, I'll just let you kind of look at this slide a little bit. Those are the articles that we used for the everyday news. So you see the source, um, from Freedom Bunker and Natural News to NPR, Chicago Sun, BBC. You can see the title of the article here, and then what we deem to be the ground truth. And I'll explain more about how we assess the ground truth, but basically, we said this one about climate change hoax was not a credible article, and this is about the avoidable measles outbreak, that was a credible article. And the articles were short; they were like between 100 and 800 words each, and there was just like a title and a text, and we had the people read them. So those were our everyday news articles, and these were our COVID ones, from the 5G uh, fad and fake virus pandemic and all kinds of fun articles that we deemed as not credible, and then a few that are credible. We have a lot more not credible articles here, just because as we were doing this, um, there were things that were like obviously not credible, and there were things that were like maybe not credible, and we wanted to give a range of credibility here, so we have a little more not credible um, news. Kelvin, you keep asking really good questions that are like um, right in my upcoming slides. I probably should have ordered the presentation differently. I'll explain about how we determine the ground truth in a minute. So I have both these questions in mind. I'm getting there. So just these are the articles that we use. All right, so here we go. So ground truth determination. So what do we mean by not credible? Oh, look. Hello. Um, there's a dog right next to me right now. Anyways, what do we mean by the ground truth? So a not credible article was deemed as such by third-party fact checkers. Okay, so when I say not credible, it means fake news in common language. Okay? So to do that, to determine the ground truth, first of all, we looked at the source level. So there's several news check services that tell you if sources are reliable or unreliable. And I can send you the links to the paper later, and it tells you which one we use and what the steps that they use to determine the credibility of a source. And so the first thing that we looked at is sources that were credible or uncredible. So NPR is credible, and the Jew World Order is not credible, according to those third-party organizations. Then within these sources, we looked for articles on the topics that were interesting to us: climate change, vaccination, and COVID. And then we picked the specific articles and we ran them through just regular third-party fact checkers like Snopes and PolitiFact and so on to check the actual article. Okay? And so if that came up as not reliable, then we said this is not credible or fake news. And if it came out as legitimate, we said this is credible. Okay? So, the contradicting facts or the misunderstanding of facts, it depends on, and you'll see in the responses of the people, some people believe them and say they're true. So, I mean, I'm not going to go really deep into, what is truth and what is knowledge, but this is based on external third-party fact checkers commonly used by journalism. In terms of the survey, before I get to the heuristics that we found, again, it was the same for both studies. We asked them for their general demographics, gender, age, education. We asked about their news consumption habits, what are the primary and secondary channels they consume news, how often they read the news, how often they share news on social media, and then what news sources they typically trust. And then the two main study questions, we said, do you believe the article that you just read? So we said, please read this article. And then, do you believe the article? 1, definitely not. 5, definitely yes. And 3, I'm not sure. And then we just left an open comment box. Why or why not do you believe the article? And then we analyzed both the 5-point scale and their open comments. So the first thing that we did was looking at heuristics. And so mostly we did this based on our first study, which had the everyday news, the vaccination, the anti-vaxxers, and the climate change. once we got the COVID responses, we scanned them again to see if there's any significantly new heuristics, but there wasn't any. Right now, we're actually writing up another paper that looks at text analysis of the comments on COVID versus the comments on the everyday news, on the vaccination. So to see actually if people, we're looking at sentiment analysis and various feeling using the Luke dictionary to see if there's a difference in those. But we haven't finished that one yet. So here are the heuristic. Okay, so getting to that second question about what are heuristics, right? So just in general, my heuristic can be longer articles are better. That could be a heuristic that I use. Maybe it's right, maybe it's wrong, but it's a rule of thumb that I'm using. Okay, so heuristic is personal decision aids, essentially. So the heuristics that we identified that people were using based on their comments are listed on the left-hand side here. And then you have examples of comments that people gave on the right-hand side. So one very commonly used justification for why people believed or didn't believe the article was because it aligned with their personal beliefs. So for example, I believe climate change is happening and we are running out of time to try and save our planet. So this is what their person believes, and the article was about climate change, and so they gave this comment as justification for their assessment. Similarly, they also use justifications that were based on alignment with their past experience. So I believe it because I use this oil and it works. So it's an article about some natural oil. And aligns with previous knowledge. So it contradicts things that I know are facts. So this person did not believe an article and gave this as an example, right? And you see people say, well, I believe it because I had chickenpox as a kid, or, my mom took me to one of those chickenpox parties so that I get sick and everybody does it. And so they use these experiences and knowledge and beliefs to justify why they, how they assess the news. Another common second set of heuristics here are the ones coming up. So they look for evidence in the article. So for example, one heuristic for why they believed or didn't believe the article was whether it provided supporting evidence. So the article doesn't give any reputable sources. I am skeptical when I can't find a link from actual medical site. So they looked for supporting evidence. They didn't find it. They said, okay, I don't believe this article. Or this information or news seems very biased against left-wing members. So this is bias perception. Accuracy perception, they says it seems factual or it seems accurate. Coherent story, how the article was written. I believe the information because it presents logical arguments. Each person is important and changing, and so on. Writing style was another one. Wait, now I got to figure out how to move the screen. Hold on. There we go. Writing style, it's written poorly and very emotionally and full of hyperbole. To the question, this is probably the best example for what is a heuristic, right? As the rule of thumb, if something is not written well, it's crap. It's not a legitimate article, right? So this is a very simple heuristic, writing style. Okay? And then the trusted source, that's another very simple heuristic. I believe it because it's coming from NPR. So my heuristic will be any news from NPR is true. Okay, and any, or even you can use it in like lesser extent, right? News from Fox News is slightly to the right, and news from CNN is slightly to the left. So you can use these kinds of heuristics. So this is what we found, and I hope that answers the question, but let me know if it didn't. So these are the heuristics that we found in the article. And so the second table that I have for you here is just the prevalence of these heuristics. So what you see here is my heuristic categories for everyday news. So when I say everyday news, it's the climate change and the anti-vaxxers, anti or pro-vax papers, and emerging news is the COVID articles. Okay. So this is the percent of people who use those arguments in their justification. It can add up to more than 100 because somebody can give me more than one heuristic. So I believe it because it aligns and because it's written well. So then I'll give them both. In terms of the method, because Julia is here and I know she's like right now thinking like, how did they code this? So we had three coders. Each of us went over all the comments. We first we gave them names, we gave them categories, and we did about 100 until we converged on the categories. Then we just had the categories on the top, and we just said yes or no if an argument fell into one of these heuristics, and then we just measured agreement between us. And then we discussed and had big fights about disagreements until they were resolved, or until one of us won. Usually they were resolved. So you can see here that what I grouped as self-cognitive heuristics are the most prominent. So people believe what they believe, essentially, and we'll get to this in a minute, in a slide or two. Source was also important, and then content, some more than others. So people are looking for supporting evidence or coherent story or writing style. You can also see, and we'll get back to this later, that there are slight differences between the heuristics used for everyday news and emerging news. So source is more important here, coherent story, accuracy. So those content heuristics kind of play a little more of a role in the emerging news situation, and we'll get back to this in the second study. So to summarize this first exploratory study, first of all, what we found was a set of heuristics. So people talk about them very generally, and the question is, well, this is really abstract, right? So we found something a little more concrete that we can get. Well, here are rules of thumb that people use when they judge news. And that's very helpful because when you're designing AI or information systems or recommendation systems, you want something a little more concrete that you can actually build into your system. We found that cognitive heuristics were the most prominent in people's decision. And we found that the identity of the source was also an important heuristic. And here, I don't have it on the slides, but we kind of sliced and diced it by age and gender and social media habit and so on. Nothing really crazy jumped from those analyses, but source heuristic was more prominently used in positive news judgments. So people believed source more than they disbelieved sources. So they had more positive thing to say about, again, NPRs, and it might have been because we used NPR, which is very strongly positive source. But people typically says, I believe it because I trust this source, more than they said, I believe it, I don't believe it because I distrust the source. So it was more positive. It might be something interesting to follow up on in another study. All right. So building on the results of this first study, what we did was then said, okay, how do we incorporate these heuristics into the AI? And how would that help? And kind of what motivated this, if you remember, there used to be the time where Facebook had those fake news flags, and then Twitter had them, and they weren't very successful. And Facebook got rid of them eventually. And so we're wondering why those fake news flags weren't successful, and how should you make them better, essentially. And that was kind of the motivating question behind this study. So the key challenge, you saw this in our previous result, is something called confirmation bias. It's the fact that those cognitive heuristics are the strongest one that people use. So confirmation bias means that people typically read information so that it confirms what they already know. And so individuals tend to disregard information that challenges their pre-existing views. So they'll just, like, if I read something and it doesn't agree with what I know, I just won't pay attention to it, or I'll skip it. I'll just read what I believe, what I already know. So confirmation bias basically makes me dig deeper into what I already believe. And so it's very difficult to change. So if you think of like anti-vaxxers, if they have their opinions, it's very difficult to change, or pro-vax, or anti and pro climate change. I always say anti-vaxxers because that's the easiest one to say, just word-wise, but all of them, right? If I believe something, then I'm going to try and believe it more. Let me just quickly read this question. Did you study if there are differences in the use of different heuristics based on people's cursors? Yeah, so we did this a little bit. We didn't find anything very significant. We found that a little bit about their social media consumption habits, but we didn't really actually get there like deeply. So we're still looking at those results. Age and gender and so on, not so much. Socioeconomic, we didn't collect. And education also didn't make a difference. Um, yes, confirmation biases, people tend to believe what they already believe. That's, yeah. And so we kind of set up two hypotheses here. First of all, confirmation bias, the previous study shows the confirmation bias is strong when prior beliefs are strong, okay? Or when you have high confidence in your decision ability. So if you're certain of what you know, then this is it. You're not gonna listen to anything different than that. And so in emerging news situation, there's a lot of uncertainty and there's a lot of very weak prior knowledge. And so we hypothesized that the effectiveness of AI advice is going to be higher in effective news situation, where confirmation bias is going to be weak simply because you don't know enough. Again, if you think of your own knowledge of COVID in April, you know, I know that I was pretty open to believe a lot of the stuff that I read just because I just didn't know enough, right? And so the second one is, so I keep moving, hold on. I gotta resize that chat box every time. Prior study also showed that AI advice with explanation performs better. So that's that one where I said, remember the fake news flag for Facebook didn't work well because it was just basically, oh, this is fake, this is not fake. So there's studies that show that if you say this is fake because, and you explain, people believe it more. And so here we said, well, the effective of the algorithmic advice is going to be higher if we tailor it to specific heuristics. So if we know that people are looking at the writing style and we say, well, this is fake because it's written in a certain way, and I'll tell you which heuristic we use in a minute, then people are more likely to believe the AI. So these were the two studies hypotheses. So in study 2, it was the same data collection on Mechanical Turk and the same 10 articles and the same question. Do you believe this article? Yes, no, and why? But we ran it as an experiment in terms of the study design. So it was a 2x4 factorial design. So the 2 was everyday news versus emerging news, and the 4 were different AI advice. So if you can imagine now, you're reading this article, let's say it's about the size of the slide, you have the title at the top and you have the text of the articles following, we put a statement at the top, okay? And that was our AI advice. So one condition had no AI, so you just see the slide like this. The next condition had generic AI. So at the top in red, you will see our smart AI system believes this article, or our smart AI system does not believe this article. And then we let you read the article. That's it. That's all we did. In the AI source condition, we said our smart AI system indicates this is a trusted news source, again, at the top in red, right? Or doesn't think it's trusted. And then the last heuristic we used was the accurate and reliable. So our smart AI system believes this article is accurate and reliable. The reason we use this is because we didn't use it here, but we actually have an AI system that assesses the accuracy and reliability. And if we wanted to, we could provide evidence or percentages to this specific heuristic. So that's the heuristic that we chose. And that's it. So we just then had you read the articles. Do you believe it? Yes, no, and why? That was the study. So for the statistical analysis here, and again, it was just a test of proportions. But what we did was we just looked at the numbers first, and you gave me an answer on a scale of 1 to 5. Do you believe this article? 1 is definitely no, 2 is probably no, 3 is I don't know, 4 is probably yes, and 5 is definitely yes. So 1 and 2 we coded as no, I don't believe the article. 4 and 5 we coded as yes, I believe the article. 3 we left out for this. And so then we measured your agreement. So if you didn't believe the article and we deemed the ground truth of the article to be fake, then you agreed with the ground truth. And if you believed the article, but we thought it was fake news, then you disagreed with the ground truth. And so P, the proportion of people who agreed with the ground truth, is what we ran our statistical analysis on. So is that clear? Okay. So here are the numbers for the proportion. And so let me move your pictures out of the way here. Okay, there we go. So the top is the everyday news, the bottom is the emerging news, and then you can see what I was comparing, and the significance number are here. Um, so let me first indicate that nothing was significant in the everyday news, but nearly everything was significant in the emerging news. Okay, and then this proportion here, 84%, this is kind of the baseline. So people who read the everyday news articles about vaccinations and climate change with no AI advice, just the article, 84% of them correctly identified it as fake or credible news. So people are pretty good at judging news, right? So 84% of them got it right. Okay, this is what the proportion means. And then you can see that even if we gave them an explanation, like even if we told them this is fake, this is not fake, they didn't listen to us. The proportions are pretty much the same. If they believed it, they believed it. If not, AI didn't make a difference here. So nothing was significant. In the emerging news, in the COVID news, it was a completely different picture. First of all, you can see that only 72% got it right. It's still impressive, I think. We're still good news consumers in general, but a lower percent of them actually got it right. So more susceptible to fake news. And then what you also see is there was significant differences. So once we started giving AI advice, they became better and better. And in fact, they went all the way up to 93%, which is a lot better than the other conditions. So when we say, well, the AI thinks this is fake news, they believed us in this condition. And that was important. Okay. And so this is what we found in the study. So to summarize it, compared with readers of everyday news, readers of emerging news, COVID news, are less likely to identify fake news on their own, are more likely to accept the advice of the AI, which is the first hypothesis, and are especially more likely to do it when the advice is tailored to a specific heuristic. So when we explain to them why we thought it was fake news or not. Which kind of also goes to the fact that they're more likely to listen to the AI. They just want the AI to be more explanatory or more supportive. So with that, we did a little bit of qualitative follow-up. Julia, am I good on time? Yeah. Okay. So just to see, because we had the comments, and again, we're still looking at things. We're still exploring this. First of all, confirmation bias. So here are some comments from the everyday news. And you can see how this confirmation bias comes out very strongly. So this is a respondent who correctly, so this person did not believe an article that we said was fake news, okay? And they say, I don't believe the global warming is made up. The scientific consensus is very strong. It's happening, caused by human behavior, carbon emission. The fact that the author is calling into question the basic principles makes me question a lot of their other assertions. You can see that they're using prior knowledge, they're using what they know, they're using what they believe. So there's strong confirmation bias. They say, well, I know global warming is an issue. Nothing is going to change my mind on that. Okay. And here's another example. This is a respondent who says, we said the article is fake news, and that person said, no, that's a legitimate article, right? So they didn't agree with us. So global warming and climate change are lies. These lies have been promoted since the 1800s. None of the predictions have panned out. None of the predictions will ever pan out. What happened to the ozone hole? What about melting ice caps? So, whether you agree with that person or not, you can see that they're using very strong beliefs and knowledge that they feel is true to justify their judgment. So there's still very strong confirmation bias here. And that's why it's difficult to change their opinion, right? This whole justification is very strongly based on their own personal views. In the emerging news, there's a lot less of that. Let me actually skip a couple slides forward and then I'll come back to this one. So here. So in the emerging news, there was still confirmation bias. If you remember the table that I showed you, there was still high percentage of cognitive heuristics, but it was a lot weaker, right? So I believe the information because it's been believed for many years that vitamin C is amazing. So this is an article about vitamin C. Why they believed an article that we said was false. So you can see the strength of this justification compared to the strength of, say, this justification or this one. So there's a lot less meat into this their belief, right? So I believe it because vitamin C is good. Or here's one that again believed a false article. I believe that the trials are happening. I've heard something about it, right? So it's a lot weaker confirmation bias, even when it exists. The other thing that we found was that they used a lot of other heuristics. So for example, they use the fact that the article has supporting evidence, makes many claims, offers no evidence of this claim. So this is the supporting evidence heuristic. Has obvious fake tone. The language used and style of writing gives the impression the article was not written by a highly educated or scientific person. I believe the news article because it seems credible and factual, and then a little bit of knowledge. I know there's been a shortage of PPE, so it seems legitimate. And then source, Reuters is usually reliable and accurate. So they're using a bigger range of arguments to try and justify their beliefs, not so much just confirmation. So in the everyday news, we would get this statement and that's it, nothing else. In the emerging news, we'd get a bunch of different ones, and then this. And the other thing that we saw in the emerging news is a lot of uncertainty and weaker opinion. So I really don't know enough about chemistry or biology or whatever field of science, or there's so many potential rumors about this, or anything is possible. So there's a lot more uncertainty, and they used it. So these were all the people who said 3, like might or might not believe it. This was their explanation. So it shows just there's a lot more uncertainty when we got to the COVID news than we got to the vaccination and climate change. So for this study, hypothesis 1 was supported, which, the greatest effectiveness of AI in emerging news. And that led us to write, to talk about the novelty of news topic. And novelty is defined in terms of the amount of new information that you get. And so the more novel a topic is, the more likely you are to accept the advice of the AI. Hypothesis 2 was partially supported. So in the everyday news, they didn't listen to the AI, and it didn't matter how we presented it. So a fake news flag or an explanation or a long and detailed proof, that they just believe what they already believed. But in the COVID news, there was there tailoring helped. Sorry, I just realized there's a question, so let me read that. Because is it possible to have confirmation bias when pre-existing categories? What do you mean by pre-existing categories? I'll wait for that. I'll get back to this question. I'm not sure I understand what pre-existing categories mean. Anyway, so the hypothesis 2 was we said we partially supported because it was supporting for the emerging news, but not the everyday news. The qualitative evidence shows that supports the confirmation bias, and the use of cognitive heuristics aligns with strongly held belief. So people are less likely to listen to the algorithm when they have strongly held belief. And when they're unsure about the topic, they're more likely to listen to the AI. So when you have no prior experience or limited, right? So I mean, yes. So when you have no prior experience, so that would be the COVID example, right? So you can have some kind of confirmation bias. I'll give you an example, right? So there's the COVID vaccine, and people are unsure about whether they'll take it or not, and then they have different opinions. And it's a new vaccine; it's that RNA, messenger RNA, and so on. And so you might not have a lot of beliefs about that specific one, but you have some kind of prior beliefs that are related about vaccinations in general, or about science, or about COVID, right? And so there's always some confirmation bias. It's just weaker, and this is what we saw. This is what we saw here, is that they still will bring up some things. It was just a weaker justification. If it's something completely new, then no, there's no confirmation bias confirms what you already know. So if you don't know, if you know absolutely nothing, but typically we always know something about related issues. So I hope that was an answer. All right, so just in terms of contributions, again, this is one of the first studies to actually look at the people and the effectiveness of news veracity interventions. And then the other issue is the timing, the novelty. Um, and so when we use the word timing, people argued it back and says, what do you mean by timing? Like, do you have to detect it early? Or, is it early when the news breaks, or is it early when the topics break? So we changed it to novelty, which is when there's not a lot of matching information. Um, of course, it's a challenge for the AI to recognize if it's fake news or not at that point as well, because it doesn't have a lot of related information to train on. But there are algorithms, and actually there's a whole field in that development of the algorithms that looks at earlier and earlier recognition. So future study can definitely like fine tune this window of opportunity and what we mean by novelty, and sharpen that definition, and look at also there's a lot, I didn't touch on it here, but there's a lot of study that says, well, conspiracy theories and fake news like spread more, in earlier stages. And so if you get to it earlier, then you can stop that spread and prevent a lot of future fake news from spreading. Like I said, we identified the set of heuristics, and that makes it easier to then incorporate in AI. And it can help media outlets to present news in convincing ways. Again, touch on these heuristics that people are already using, some specific writing styles or specific, supporting evidence and so on. It can help in creating news tags or taxonomies and other ways to support news consumers. We looked at the tailored advice, so I don't have it here, but we did some in ANOVA, like we coded the data a little differently, and then we ran an ANOVA to look at the interactions. And so the study shows that there's definitely a strong interaction between, the novelty in the topic and then the tailoring of the advice. So tailored advice works better when you're open to the advice. I mean, it's kind of a no-brainer, right? Like tailored advice works better when you're willing to take an advice, right? So if you're not willing to take the advice, nothing's going to change your mind. But we only looked at the 2 heuristics, so future work can look at more heuristics, not just the 2 that we used. And then we also kind of highlighted the trade-offs between cognitive heuristics and more objective heuristics, such as content and source, especially again in the novel situation. So you can look at the role of uncertainty in that trade-off. So does this trade-off become more pronounced when news are uncertain? Finally, just from a practitioner's point of view, fact-checking organizations, they often fact-check information that's already been highly engaged with. Just basically, if the more popular it is, the more fact-checking is happening. But what we say is actually it's more important to fact-check earlier information before it gets heavily engaged in, and then continue working on early detection methods from the novelty point of view. So the earlier we can say, well, this is not true, the better we can stop the spread of fake news, essentially. And this is it.
Thank you so much, Dorit, for this fantastic presentation. And we all deal with all kinds of news coming our ways. So it's obviously actually helps to understand how we interpret news, how we think about everything which comes our way, in particular with COVID and vaccinations. So before we take questions, I think that we already start seeing some questions coming. I wanted to ask something quickly in terms of volume of general news in comparison to emerging news, because probably emerging news are much higher in volume. So it is also in terms of information overload, whether we want or not, we are forced to deal with much higher volumes of things which are related to those topics which we don't have experience. So is there anything from the study or in terms of your experience doing this from this experiment which has to do with volume of novelty and the amount of news coming our way and where AI can help?
That's a good question. We didn't look at it here. I mean, I would assume again, there's volume is like there's so many dimensions to that volume, right? So one thing is just the length of exposure. Like if you think about how long you've been hearing about climate change, and so that temporal dimension is one aspect of volume. I've been hearing about it for a really long time versus I've just been hearing about it right now. Like you said, people are exposed more to these news, and then exposure, again, there's a bunch of literature that talks about passive exposure. So when you scroll through your Facebook and things come up and you don't even notice, and that's actually the bigger spread of fake news is through this passive consumption of news. But we did not deal with it here, but it's definitely something that we wanted to see. And we also, in that sense, wanted to see um, if we can track the AI longitudinally, if we can look at your relationship with the AI as it gives you advice, and whether you're going to be more open to the advice of the AI, the more advice you get from the AI.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you. And so I typed a message for everybody. So we have about 12 minutes. So you can either type your questions or you can switch your video on and actually ask question verbally if anybody wishes. Because we have a good combination of, I think, practitioners, academics across business school, some students. So you're welcome to switch your video and ask question if you would like.
Hi, Julia. Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. I'm just wondering, like looking at your findings, thinking back to these 70, 80, 90% of proportions that you mentioned in terms of how many people guessed it correctly, but it was fake or not, the news item. I mean, considering the high volumes of fake news on the internet, isn't it surprising that so many people guessed it correctly?
I mean, you're using the word guessed, right? When you read news, I mean, you're an educated news reader, right? So, well, I mean, we all read news, right? So, and again, we all use these heuristics. So it's like it's more of an educated guess. And so, anything, again, I'm using NPR just because I think it's the less debatable source there, but right, anything that comes out of NPR, we say, yeah, that's true, right? And so, this is our educated guess. Is the article is NPR, I'm going to believe it, right? And in this study, that will get you to the right, and you would agree with us, right? And so I think that the bulk of the percentages comes from these kind of very simple heuristics. There's news are not so much the topic, but the way news are written is predictable. The journalistic principles are the same, and people write the news in the same way, and the fake news site writes them in the same way. So we also learn to recognize those patterns and build on them. And so there's a lot more around that guess that we use.
Also, in terms of the source, have you guys looked into, like, a lot of people read news on social media these days, right? So they get forwarded to you by your friends.
Right.
I'm just wondering whether that is something that you've looked into. I guess, there are, these social circles are forming. So I believe in news that my friends believe in, I guess, or I'm getting the news that my friends believe in.
Right, and we definitely saw that, and we asked for it in the control variable. So, like in terms of exploring the heuristics. In this case, because in the experiment, we gave them the news, and we said, read this article. So anything that they would have from their friends who believed in would go into their confirmation bias or, their pre-existing behavior. But yeah, absolutely, the most people get news from their friends and social media exposure, for sure. There's something here.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
Thanks, Laszlo.
So there's something here in the how is the AI? So in this study, we actually didn't use our AI. So there is an AI. You can look. Oops, sorry. Nella. That's the dictionary that Ben developed. If you just Google that and probably his name, that will get you to the website where you can see that AI tool and the algorithm. I'll tell you in a minute about another really cool tool that he has there. We didn't use the AI here, so it wasn't like on the fly, this is new, this is fake, this is not. We just put those statements because we wanted a control experiment. But the way that he has the AI, we use it in previous study, is the AI can give you that kind of explanation. So this article is 70% accurate based on the following features of the algorithm. So we're able to provide this advice. We just wanted to keep it simple for the experiment. What I wanted to tell you about for his work, and I think is really cool, is he actually used a social network analysis of news sources. And looked at the fake news patterns, and he clustered them. So you can see like the right-wing fake sources, the left-wing fake sources, the mainstream media, and so on. And so he has taken it up from the article level to a source level, which is another really interesting future research avenue, is what level of analysis do you study the fake news at? If anybody here is interested, I think that's a really promising area.
And Dorit, I think it's worth mentioning that this paper, which is based on these two studies, is available and published, right?
Yeah, it's published in Computer and Human Behavior Reports. It's an open source, so I'll send you the link.
Yeah. So basically, just while you're reading the next question, so what I can share with participants, that there will be a actual link to the paper, so you can read a completed research, or if you have students, colleagues, anybody else who's interested, you can read the actual paper in addition to the link to the video which we're just recording. So there is another question.
Yeah. So yeah, we didn't, like, when you got in the experiment, if you were doing our study and you get an article and it said at the top, our AI thinks it's accurate. Our AI didn't really think it's accurate. We didn't ask the AI. We just put the statement at the top because we just wanted to see how people responded to the statement. We weren't testing what the AI can or cannot do. So this study, if you think about the process of there's the news coming, it goes through the algorithm, it's getting an assessment, and it goes to the reader. We just focus at the very end, like after the algorithm makes a judgment, and then what the reader thinks. So it's kind of like taking this really long process and breaking it into small parts.
And I think from the design of from the perspective of how and why you would design certain AI tool in certain way and implement it for specific context, this is kind of study you need to understand and take inputs of this study into the actual design of AI tool and the actual selection of AI tool which is suitable or not. So if Facebook have used extra explanation of this is fake because perhaps more people would have believed it. So this is where this study fits in terms of relevance to design of AI and implementation of AI.
Right, right. And the only important thing is to keep in mind is that you want to make sure that you're studying things that the AI can actually do, which is why we focus on the source and accuracy, which were things that we know our algorithm is capable of assessing.
Because you don't want to invest too much in AI and then nobody is using it, even if it gives really good recommendations.
Right, right.
Thank you. The reasons I'm commenting this because I know that there are also a few students taking our new course Managing with AI. So I think that some of the questions are coming from colleagues and some of questions are coming from students. So there is a variety of the exposure to AI and variety of interests, why people are interested in this particular research on AI. Any other questions? I don't see all participants, so if anybody would like to ask you a question verbally, we have probably time for one or two more questions. No? Okay, so Dorit, you will send me the link and I will distribute the paper, which is open source. And I would like to thank Dorit for taking time during her evening to give us this fantastic presentation and share this very, very important research on this very relevant and important topic. Thank you, Dorit, and thank you for everybody for taking your lunch time. And I think it's good we asked people to switch the screens because then you can bring your lunch and eat while listening. Our seminars usually run between 2 to 3 o'clock, but to accommodate the time zone differences, we put it a little bit earlier today.
If you're looking in the window behind me, I started when there was light out, and now it's completely dark.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dorit, again, and
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for having me.
thank you for everybody for participation.